Every year, for thousands of years, the same thing happened in Egypt. The Nile rose, spread across the fields, and left behind a layer of dark, fertile silt. Then it withdrew, and in the soft mud the farmers planted. Everything in Egyptian life depended on that flood, and on a single question that followed it. How much of what grew would be measured, gathered, and set aside? Long before Egypt had coins, it had a way of storing the future, and it kept it in grain.
We think of wealth as money, and money as metal or paper we can count. For most of its history, Egypt had almost none of that. There were no coins in the age of the pyramids, and none for most of the time of the pharaohs. Value was reckoned instead in measures of grain and weights of metal, and the grain was not a symbol of wealth, it was the wealth. A worker was paid in grain, a temple was endowed in grain, a tax was levied, and a famine was survived in grain. To understand Egyptian wealth, you have to stop thinking about coins and start thinking about a full storehouse. The reason this worked was the extraordinary regularity of the Nile. Once a year, the river flooded, and the height of that flood decided the fate of the harvest. So the Egyptians measured it. They cut gauges into the riverbanks and into special wells, the instruments we call nilometers, and officials recorded how high the water climbed. A strong flood promised abundance, and the state prepared to gather a large surplus. A weak flood warned of scarcity, and the same records told the administration that hard years were coming. The flood was not just weather, it was a forecast, and Egypt built its accounting around reading it. What the state gathered, it stored. Across Egypt, the palace and the great temples operated granaries on a scale that matched the monuments. Thick-walled storehouses and rows of domed silos, filling after each harvest with the grain taken in tax. This was the centre of the economy. From these stores came the rations that paid labourers, including the craftsmen who built the royal tombs, the seed that started the next season, and the reserves that stood between the population and starvation. And all of it was counted. Scribes measured every quantity in and out, recording deposits and disbursements on flakes of limestone and sheets of papyrus, because a store that is not accounted for is not a reserve. It is just a pile waiting to be lost. Over time, this system of stores and scribes became something remarkably close to banking. By the age of the Ptolemies, Egypt operated a network of state granaries that worked as accounts. A farmer or official could deposit grain in a local granary and hold a balance there, recorded in the register. And crucially, that grain could be moved without moving. A written order could transfer a quantity from one person's account to another's in a different place, while the physical grain stayed exactly where it was. The whole network was centralized, with a central bank in Alexandria coordinating the branches. This was a giro system, a way of settling debts by adjusting records rather than hauling sacks, and it was running on grain, millennia before paper money. The purpose behind all of it was older and simpler than banking. It was the management of risk. Egypt knew, with a certainty few societies have had, that good years and bad years came in sequence, and that the bad ones would come whether or not anyone prepared. A store of grain was insurance against a future the Nile had already half revealed. In a year of strong flood, the surplus was not simply consumed or celebrated, it was held, because the records of past floods and the plain experience of generations said that a low flood and a thin harvest were only a matter of time. That principle found its most famous expression in a story. In the biblical account, Pharaoh dreams of 7 fat cows devoured by 7 lean ones, and 7 full ears of grain swallowed by 7 withered ones. Joseph interprets the dream as a warning. 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of famine. His advice is not clever finance, it is discipline. Store grain through the good years, hold it under the authority of the state, and release it through the bad ones. Whatever the history behind the story, it describes exactly what Egypt's granaries were for. The dream is a lesson about reserves, told in the language of a civilization that lived and died by them.
And when the reserve failed, the consequences were severe. Egyptian records remember years of low flood and hunger, times when the grain did not come and the storehouses could not cover the shortfall. In the worst of them, order itself frayed. A society that depended on a central store was strong when that store was full and dangerously exposed when it ran empty. The same centralization that let Egypt feed its workers and survive lean years also meant that when the reserve was mismanaged or simply overwhelmed by a run of bad floods, there was no second cistern to fall back on. The granary was the safety net, and there was nothing beneath it. This is the tension Egypt hands down. A reserve is only as good as the discipline that fills it and the honesty that guards it. Egypt succeeded for longer than almost any state in history because it took the surplus of the good years seriously, measuring it, storing it, accounting for it, and holding it against the lean years it knew were coming. The system was not sophisticated in the way we usually mean. It had no coins, no interest, no markets in the modern sense. It had something more fundamental, the habit of saving at scale, enforced by the state and recorded by the scribe. We tend to measure financial progress by complexity, by new instruments and faster money. Egypt is a reminder that the oldest instrument is also the most reliable. Before there was money to save, there was grain to store, and the civilization that stored best endured longest. The farmer watching the Nile withdraw, and the scribe counting the harvest into the granary, were practicing the first and most durable form of financial security ever devised. Not the accumulation of wealth, but the deliberate holding of a reserve against a future that everyone could see coming, and most were tempted to ignore.